You're tuning into the Active Mom Podcast with physical therapist, Dr. Carrie Pagliano, a real mom's guide to all things postpartum return to workouts after baby. If you're a postpartum mom, coach, trainer, or physical therapist looking for answers on how to get back to running, CrossFit, yoga, Pilates, HIIT, you name it, without the fear of pelvic floor issues or doing something wrong, this is the podcast for you. Let's start the show. All right. Our next guest is a returning guest. The last time we had her on was fall of 2022, which seems like it's like another lifetime ago. And in research, lots of papers ago. So we welcome Margie Davenport to the show. Thanks for coming on again.
Thanks for having me.
All right. For anybody who has not listened to Margie's first episode, tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and kind of like what your general interest is. And then we'll dive into the good stuff.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I'm a professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology, Sport and Recreation at the University of Alberta in beautiful Edmonton, Canada. My research really focuses on the impact of physical activity and exercise during pregnancy and in the postpartum period. And it spans from, really complex pregnancies and people who have contraindications to exercise during pregnancy, right up to elite athletes who engage in training at the very highest levels during and following pregnancy.
So she's also one of our faves to just like ask questions rando and be like, okay, who do we know about all this stuff? So, and you were involved in the Delphi study, which we've had Shefali Christopher on, and we'll be talking to Rita Deering. You also were involved in Christina Previtt's lifting paper that looked at kind of women lifting in pregnancy and kind of what that's looking like. So you're playing with some of our favorites, which we really enjoy.
But they're my favorites too.
Which is why we get along. So not to go too big picture, but like what have you been diving into the past like year and a half? What's been the focus and what's coming out of it?
Well, I'm not so sure I'm terribly focused right now. There's so many exciting things that are ongoing and upcoming. Unfortunately, I do sort of get a little scattered, and it's kind of hard to sort of wrap it up in one little bubble in 10, 20 seconds. But a lot of the work that we're trying to do is really attempting to push the boundaries of what we know and understand about exercise, especially during pregnancy, but certainly in the postpartum period. So later this year, the 2024 Canadian guidelines on physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep are going to be coming out. So we can chat about that again if you want to. And I keep saying almost now, but it'll be a few more months. So that's ongoing and has been a huge project over the last 2 years, actually, but it's nearly finished. And then we're doing lots looking at elite athletes, looking at people who are doing heavy resistance training during pregnancy. Those studies are ongoing with Christina Previtt, who's now started a postdoc with me, which is fantastic. So we're really trying to make changes and strides in that particular area. And those studies are ongoing, and we definitely need some help for sure. And then we're doing lots of work looking at policy. Elite athletes, they go into pregnancy or they're thinking about becoming pregnant, but there's not necessarily really clear indication of, what's going to happen to them. Are they going to maintain the ranking, their place on the team? Will they get financial supports when they try to return? Are they going to have individualized recommendations in terms of how to return, or do they just sort of pop back in at 6 weeks postpartum? And so we're trying to develop and understand a little bit more about the needs of elite level athletes, but also the national sport organizations, coaches and healthcare providers as well. So lots going on, very exciting times. But I also get a little forgetful sometimes, all over the place.
Well, I feel like it's a lot of things all at once in a lot of different compartments, and I think we've got like almost like the physiology, biomechanical, like physio sort of side of things. We're like, okay, what actually happens? And then exercise wise, what should we be doing prescription wise? And then we've got elite versus like the average, pregnant postpartum athlete. And then there's this whole advocacy policy side and being able to show up to races. And then parallel to the research, I feel like we've seen so many more performances. And
and so many more athletes sharing their stories. And
Mhm.
so for you to be overwhelmed, like I get it, because I feel like it's this beautiful time, but it's all coming at once. And then of course throw into it, energy deficiency and kind of nutrition and kind of bone stress and just like it's a lot, and it makes me
Yeah.
excited, but I also get a little overwhelmed too.
Mhm.
So maybe let's like break it down a little bit as far as
Mhm.
let's start with maybe like the physio exercise kind of background piece. And I think what people don't realize that you have a lovely perspective on is I think the average person assumes that an elite athlete has all this stuff at their disposal and the best of the best, and can kind of cherry pick what they need and who they're going to have to support them, which
Mhm.
really isn't remotely close to being the truth. So can you start with that piece?
Sure. I mean, just one point. I think last time we talked, I said we were at a watershed moment. We are
Yeah.
definitely in the watershed. We are right here.
Yep.
And, the really exciting piece is that there are so many people around the world and we're all working together and collaborating. And that is what's making this change and this difference. And it's happening rapidly. So it's very, very exciting times
Yeah.
that with things happening. And you're absolutely right. When we talk about elite level athletes, there is, in many cases, an assumption that they do have the best, the greatest support. And in some cases, 100% true. And there's lots of examples of really high profile athletes who do have those really fantastic supports, people who know what they're doing to be able to guide them through this entire very stressful process where you go into pregnancy, and for many athletes they want to return but they don't know if they can, if they'll be able to
Right.
get back onto the team or not. And then we have many athletes who just have very limited support. They're often told that they can't continue to play or train with the team past the first trimester. And then you're just sort of left floating on your own
Right.
a little bit, and that becomes even more stressful. So we've been doing a lot of qualitative work over the last probably like 4 years now, to better understand the experiences of elite level athletes during pregnancy and the postpartum period across different sports, across different levels of supports, to see what really works and what doesn't, and to get a better sense of what these athletes really do want or need to be able to return after childbirth. Now, to be fair, there are many who are quite ready to retire and move on to the next phase of their life, and that is 100%
Yeah.
okay. Where I become concerned are the athletes who want to return but just don't know how or don't have the supports to be able to do it, and that's the place that we're really trying to work and make changes at this particular point in time.
Yeah. What sports specifically have you kind of dove into a little bit, and where are there similarities between sports and where are there differences?
Right. So in most of our highest profile athletes, they're very high profile, and so we do work very hard to keep it anonymous as much as possible. So we don't currently identify what sports they're in. It's a broad range of individual and team sports in the summer and the winter Olympics. We do have some upcoming sports specific studies that are happening with elite soccer football players. But that would be the only sport that we're currently
Open about.
identifying. Mm,
Yeah. And I think that too, I mean, some people might say, well, geez, does that help? And the fact of the matter is, like, again, it's historical. We're just getting people that are open about this and
mm,
willing to participate in research and so on. And I think that's where sometimes we have the barriers, is when you have a small number, it's really easy to identify who these people are. You don't,
exactly.
yeah, and you want to have the anonymity and that sort of thing too. And it's I would imagine somewhat limiting to kind of be able to say, okay, well, this sport is, XYZ, whatever, versus this. But I'm assuming later on that's the plan, is when we get enough people to be able to participate, then we can start to tease stuff out a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we're really at the very beginning of really understanding the implications of continuing participation in elite sport during and following pregnancy. We're just getting to the point where we can start to look at sports specific. But
Yeah.
again, many of the athletes we talk to are the first athlete who has ever been pregnant in their
Right.
sport. And so, this is such a new area. we think about running where it's becoming much more common, or
Yep.
tennis where it's becoming a lot more common, or soccer. But there are many, many sports out there where there has never been a pregnant athlete come
Right.
back again. And so we can't identify them at this particular point in time. But moving forward, this is really going to change, and
Yeah.
we're excited for what's going to happen.
Yeah. From some of the qualitative studies that you've done, are there things that you feel like the average person could kind of relate to, or you could extrapolate and apply to like the average athlete who's become a mom?
Hmm. It's a good question. I mean, when we talk to sort of our elite level athletes, especially, we have a recent paper that's looking at before pregnancy. And with this particular study, these are athletes who had not become pregnant yet, but they're considering it, and they're trying to make that decision about whether or not they're going to be pregnant and return afterwards, or if they're going to retire and then try to start a family. And for the vast majority of them, they really want to know what is going to happen to them. Athletes are planners. I was a big planner when I was an athlete, still am. I want to know what the implications are. Is this
Right.
going to be career ending for me? Am I going to have some level of support? Am I going to have some level of financial support? You have to,
Right.
find that with many athletes, at least here in Canada, they don't actually qualify for, we call it EI employment insurance. So you get
Mm,
paid maternity leave, but because they're not technically employees, they don't get
right.
that. Right. And so
Hmm.
understanding the actual implications is really, really important. And then when we talk about how to return or how to continue during pregnancy, we have such limited research at this particular point in time. We're really starting to navigate and understand that. But if you think back, like the 2019 Canadian guidelines were the first where we really conclusively showed that you're not actually going to harm the baby by exercising during
Right.
pregnancy, right? So that was what, 5 years ago, 6 years ago that it really came
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
And so it's not that surprising that we're still at this point where we need to understand the implication of, what is going to happen if you do HIIT exercise during pregnancy? What happens if you lift heavy during pregnancy? It's
Right.
only because, we now know that moderate, even into vigorous intensity exercise is safe and has very low risk for harm. For people that don't have contraindications to exercise during pregnancy, that we can start to even look at these more
Right.
extremes of exercise in pregnancy and postpartum.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a really good point. Is it and it does, I think in some ways feel like a million years ago that we were just trying to establish that it's safe. And it is I think a strange place when you step back from
Mhm.
kind of this hyper niche because when you're looking at those really high level athletes and okay, can we push beyond that? When
Mhm.
the average person, I still have moms being told, to stop running or stop doing, normal exercise or things in a basic pregnancy. And
Mhm.
so you really realize the gap that's I think it's getting bigger, if that makes any sense. It's like we haven't really come out of the dark ages in some
Mhm.
places. And we're trying to push this forward, but we got to remember to kind of reach back and pull everybody else along
Mhm.
with us.
Well,
Um,
I totally agree with you. I think the knowledge translation of, the Canadian guidelines, World Health Organization guidelines, the Australian, the UK, like guidelines right around the world, we say the same thing,
yeah,
right? That exercise is generally health and beneficial for almost everybody during their pregnancy. Contraindications, we can have a conversation about that. Those are there for a reason.
right.
Um, but the word isn't getting out there. We're, talking to people who are excited and curious about exercise, but we're not necessarily reaching the healthcare providers or people who have really never had physical activity and exercise as a big part of their lives. And
Right.
so one of the reasons that I am starting to focus a lot more on elite athletes, partly because I was one myself, so I'm curious from my own perspective.
Yeah.
But I think if we have the role models who show that you can continue to train and compete at a high level during
Mhm.
pregnancy and return to the high level that they were before conception, that these role models are going to be much more effective than any knowledge translation campaign that we can have
Yep.
through public health.
Yeah, no, I think you have a really good point there. I mean, if you look at a lot of the more high profile athletes that have,
Mhm.
been really open about their pregnancies
Yeah.
and postpartum, I mean, a lot of people will look to that influencer or that athlete for what did they do
Mhm.
before before their own provider, which, there's a pro con to that. But
Yes.
yeah.
Different conversation.
I mean, and that's where I think us as providers, we look at these athletes with just so much hope to be like,
Mhm.
I hope you have support. I hope you have somebody with like good information in your ear. I hope you have access to this because they can really make life easier for us as clinicians, or they can make it really hard.
Mhm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, the other tough thing is when we look at the elite athletes and the role models, we almost always hear about the success stories and,
Yeah.
all of the great, inspiring information. And, one of the areas that we've been trying to understand a little bit more is about those people who wanted to come back but couldn't
Couldn't.
or weren't successful in their return. And I think there's a
Yep.
real gap in understanding. And I think if we can
Yes.
understand how or why they were not able to return,
Mhm.
um, especially when they had this desire to, I think
Right.
that's where we can actually start to make improvements and help fill those supports or fill that knowledge
Right.
to support future generations.
Right. Those are definitely the ones that I'll get in the DMs where people like,
Mm,
hey, I thought I was going to be able to come back to this. I did everything,
mhm.
right. And then obviously, as we know, a lot of
Yeah.
things occur potentially in delivery, and to have, people think that they have it set up to have perfect on the other side. I mean, it can change. And then who's going to come work with you? And I think there's a
Yeah.
disparity there too. I mean, we have a hard enough time getting decent access to care for the average person, much less somebody who can understand birth injuries, pelvic floor
Mhm.
injuries, and then that elite return to whatever sport that may be. It's a whole nother.
Mhm.
So that's another place too, where I think you have a really good point. It's like, hey, we see this no issues returning back, but what about when
Yeah.
there are challenges for sure.
Yeah. No,
Um,
and that's
you
where we really struggle. We have put out, the invites to, come talk to us, let us know about your
mhm,
story. And we just don't, we don't have the pickup. People don't want to come and talk to us about, the
mm,
fact that they weren't successful in returning. And I totally get that. I don't want to talk about my rejections or, when I
yeah,
wasn't successful doing lots of things. But I think it's still an exceptionally important story that we as researchers need to hear and know about so that we
mhm,
know how to support next
yep,
time.
yep. No, it's interesting. I actually, I DM'd somebody the other day, your information and a couple other researchers. I was listening to, there's an ultra run podcast called Trail Society, and it's, I think all the hosts are researchers, which is really cool, but none of them have
Amazing.
kids yet. But
Okay.
things that they talk about on the regular, because they're an ultra community, is they talk about fueling, which I think is awesome.
Massive.
They
Yeah.
talk about energy deficiency across the spectrum. They talk about postpartum. They talk about perimenopause and menopause. Like, they talk about just menstruation, which I think is fantastic. And they're like, we need more researchers. If you guys know any researchers in pregnancy, postpartum, I'm like, I know them. I know them. Let me give you their names. So I have more work for you to do.
Well,
Um,
you know what? We have a case study on absolutely incredible ultra marathoner that's shared her data and information and story with us. So there is actually going to be a case study coming out because it's still relatively unusual and it is a cool story. She's brilliant.
awesome. No,
Yeah.
and I more of those stories, and that's where
Hmm.
I'm not picking them up on social. I'm picking them up on kind of like a couple off podcasts or,
Hmm.
sport specific things where they're being invited on, and maybe that host will start into their birth story. And sometimes they're great and dive into it a little bit deeper. And sometimes they just scoot right over it because it's like a male and they're uncomfortable.
Hmm.
And be like, oh, but how are you now? Like anything with birthing, I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna get infected by it. Um, yeah, anyway. Um,
Good.
no, but one of the things that I hear so much in the rewritten, and again, my headspace is more in kind of the running community, is, and I don't know if you'd be able to speak to this, more of kind of like understanding how to navigate that low estrogen, postpartum, fueling, overtraining, energy deficiency, like, and you did a paper for BJSM kind of looking at coach and healthcare provider experiences and stuff. Like, can you kind of maybe pull those pieces together a little bit to, because not all coaches and healthcare providers know necessarily how to navigate those things. And we're still, again, we're still learning. We're drinking from the fire hose here. Maybe speak to that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I really feel for coaches and healthcare providers because, they are not trained in this particular area, and they are having to work with those athletes on a day-to-day basis and make,
Right.
decisions about basically their future, their performance, whether or not they can stay on the team or if they have to leave. And they have the exact same information or same access to information that we do, which is very limited, pretty minimal. Anyways, we really do have to do better to be able to provide the evidence to be able to support athletes, certainly during pregnancy, but especially in the postpartum period for those who want to return. And you touch on a really great point. We don't talk enough about fueling, especially in the postpartum period, and especially while we're breastfeeding. The nice news is, exciting news is that, I've been doing some work with some collaborators around the world. And we have data to start to look at this. If you have a diagnosis of REDS at some point in your life, and what happens in terms of your pregnancy, delivery outcomes, and into the postpartum period. So we are still recruiting for that one, but we've done some initial data analysis, and it's absolutely fascinating. But I think that the fueling side of it is something that we don't talk about enough, especially with elite athletes in the postpartum period. So there's some work coming up, but unfortunately not yet.
No, and again, like just thinking back, even 2-3 years ago, I don't think we were having some of these conversations. And and I think what's tricky as a clinician is you recognize, okay, definitely if working out is their day job, yes, we need to do this. But how again do we extrapolate that down to the average mom? And potential risk factors, like did they have an eating disorder before pregnancy? Do they turn to exercise for stress relief? Are they saying things like, I need to get my body back, or things like that? Like any sort of thoughts that you have about, again, how we can kind of take some of this information and extrapolate it down to an average athlete population?
So as part of the Canadian postpartum guidelines that are coming up, we actually put together a Delphi study. So there's a guideline consensus panel, but then I also recruited/convinced, a number of the leads for major international exercise during pregnancy and postpartum guidelines. So we have representation from around the world. What we were trying to do is to identify if there are specific conditions that are contraindications in the postpartum period where, you need to see your primary healthcare provider before you begin or continue exercise. But the second really important piece that we wanted to get out of that are what are the key screening, exercise pre-screening areas that we have to talk about. And one of them that I've been really advocating for, and my colleagues around the world as well, is to look at things like REDS. If they have a history of an eating disorder, that sort of thing, so that we do have like this checkpoint, whether it's at 1 week, 6 weeks, 12 weeks, wherever, so that we do actually do some sort of screening for all people in the postpartum period. To identify if there are risk factors, for underfueling, bone stress fractures, that sort of thing. So it's like a very high level first sort of pass. But the goal after developing, it's basically going to be like the Get Active questionnaire postpartum. So the sister to Get Active questionnaire for pregnancy. And once we have finished that, we're going to start to validate it to make sure that it's getting to the questions in the general areas that we're trying to really make an impact.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic to just, especially if people aren't used to asking those questions.
Right.
And if we are screening our moms sooner, like I know here in the States, there's a push to try and get earlier contact
Mhm.
with healthcare providers. Whether that's actually truly happening or not, I don't know. I will typically try and see moms between 3 and 4 weeks
Mhm.
postpartum. And there's a
Mhm.
lot of opportunities to at least just get a sense of how things are going with sleep. And are you eating? Is your baby having, feeding issues? Is that impacting what you're eating? And just kind of get a sense of where their headspace is so you can
Mhm.
figure out what referral sources that might need to be brought in to get them supported going
Absolutely.
through.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's one of the things for me. Like again, just if that's not where your headspace is, have some sort of screening tool to at least help guide you to figure out, hey, this is something that we need to go in further, or nope, you know what, I think we're good
Mhm.
here. Let's just kind of keep moving on. So
Yeah.
I'm excited to see that.
Me too.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are you in the middle of now that you're allowed to talk about? And maybe tell us real quick why you can't talk about certain things, because those of us that aren't in research, we would like to understand why you can't talk about things. Why do you have to be covert?
Why? Yeah. So when we talk about research, we'll put together a study and we'll do the analysis, and we find what we find, then we write it up as a paper. But a really essential, I don't know, like safety check or double check that we go through is this process called peer review. So when we submit a paper to a journal, it goes out. Oftentimes, we have no idea who's reviewing it, and certainly there's pros and cons to the process, but I still think it's an essential step that we go through just to make sure we're getting this external validation that we haven't completely missed something, or we've run our analysis completely wrong. I would hope at this point in my career I know what I'm doing enough that I'm not screwing it all up. But it's still an essential step that we take, and so until we have actually gone through that process, I'm not super comfortable saying it's
Mm,
completely safe to do this until I can present the evidence that has gone through peer review and actually show you the data that supports it. We do certainly do it at conferences, but if there's sometimes we just don't present any data early. It only comes out with publication. So a great example of that is I can't talk about what the Canadian postpartum guidelines are going to be because they're still being massaged and refined at this particular point in time. So we actually do, consultation. We talk to and get feedback from healthcare providers, definitely postpartum people, to see what they think of it and tell us if the messaging is appropriate. The first time I sent it out, it was like, you're going to cause a lot of mom guilt. And, as a mom myself, there's no way that is not the message. I don't
okay.
want that to come across. These are, recommendations about physical activity and sleep. If you can do them, that's fantastic. If you can't quite get there yet, there's time. It's something that you work towards. And so refining and working on the messaging so that it's not something that, as a mom who's completely sleep deprived, which I was for many years, you're not looking at it and going, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. They're ridiculous.
Right.
Right. And so until things have gone through the appropriate steps and checks and balances, I personally just don't talk about things too much.
No, and I think that's important to understand, and for I think the average person that may not understand research process and things like that too, not understanding peer reviewed versus non peer reviewed
Yeah.
documents. Maybe a quick blurb on that.
Yeah. So, so peer review is basically, we have this database, we call it PubMed. So when I teach in my undergrad courses, we do talk a lot about research. And, the easiest way to check and see if something has been peer reviewed is if it's on this website called PubMed. You have to be a relatively reputable, although not always, journal. But then we have, you know, Instagram and TikTok and Twitter, and the influencers. We also have magazines as well. that are going to put out different articles, and the information isn't necessarily correct. Oftentimes it's based on personal experience. I have my own personal experience. Some of it's good, some of it is bad. But that's not necessarily generalizable to the entire population. It's why we do research. It's why we, try to be as objective as possible and not infuse our positive or negative spins on the research. We have to be fairly objective. So peer review is really important. It does help to maintain a standard of, like a standard that we're trying to get to, so that we have confidence in the findings. And the science is always changing. If we think back in 1985, we were significantly concerned about the fact that exercise might harm the baby and the mother. And by the time we get to 2019, we're talking almost 25 years. I can't do my math. Much longer than that. The research is completely changed, and it is a very healthful and beneficial behavior that we encourage from conception right up to delivery.
Yeah, no, it's quite a change. Remind me how old your kids are again?
They are now 9 and 11.
That's right, because I was thinking ours were similar. Mine are
very similar.
10 and 13. And yeah, no, I think that's the thing. And maybe we'll shift gears a little bit and then kind of talk about, we talked a bit in the last podcast about your experience and so on, but are you jealous at all now about like what we know now that you and I did not know then? Because I've seriously had a bit of FOMO. And where I'm running into it is with women our vintage, our generation, that did not have the benefit of the information that we have now. And now they're diving into perimenopause and menopause. And like, there's that gap of things that they need to kind of get caught up. I don't know if you're kind of seeing that, maybe not so much in your research, but more in kind of like your friend group, your social group, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I was pregnant and postpartum, I was a little bit different because I was doing the research. And so I had my own opinions on what was safe and not safe. And, we're starting to show that my gut instinct back then was appropriate for the most part. I think the biggest thing I wish I had done more of is resistance training.
Yeah.
I think it is the most underappreciated, done. That's not really a word. But we're not doing enough resistance training. And it's not just in pregnancy. It's not just in postpartum. When we talk about perimenopause, because I'm getting there, I'm not there quite yet. Pretty sure pretty soon, when we talk about perimenopause, that is probably the most important thing we can do, but we're not talking about it. There's not research about it. Yeah, I think perimenopause, and I mean, not just because I'm so close, if not in there, I think that's probably one of the biggest places we need to make massive change. I won't be doing it. Somebody else much smarter than me will be doing it. But we have to know and understand, because we have people who are in the postpartum period and they're also perimenopausal. So what do you do?
Yep.
Anyways.
Yeah, no, I was curious if you were going to make a shift, because I've definitely, I'm not sure how much you know, but I kind of dove headfirst into menopause in the fall. And
I do follow you on Instagram.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So it's really been a learning curve, but looking at that from a menopausal lens completely has shifted my look at that early postpartum phase and be like, wow, we're missing this whole like low estrogen thing. And it really is quite a parallel. So, I mean, and that I think is like the good news, bad news, double-edged sword about being in this space is like things that I didn't realize for years and years and years treating this population. You're like, okay, nobody's dead, but I could have done it better. But we didn't know,
No, exactly. And when you know better, you do better, but there's nothing we can do. We did the best that we could at that point in time. And I think it's the same, with perimenopause. What we're going to understand in the next, decade is going to be completely different than what we understand now. You probably don't know, but my postdoctoral fellowship was actually in postmenopausal women, looking at exercise and cognition. So there's definitely an interest there. I'm curious. And the one big FOMO for me with that research is I wish I'd asked about pregnancy complications. I tried to convince my supervisor, and like, oh, that's just one more thing to ask. But I think it's actually really, really important.
Right.
And we could have made a big change, because that was 12 years ago now.
Right.
We could have had phenomenal information. Anyways.
Yeah, no.
Next time.
The further we get, the more we're like, I should have asked about that, and I should have asked about that. And it's, no, I wish we could kind of like go back in time and figure that stuff out and pull it forward.
Should have pushed for it harder.
Yeah, no, it definitely.
Yeah.
For sure. But yeah, back to load too. Like, I almost think that was something, and I don't think it was just female related either. I feel like load was such a newer concept, almost in like the last 10 years in physio, because, we were too busy as clinicians, like bad mouthing CrossFit and that kind of stuff. And now, at least here in the States, I don't know if it's this way in Canada, but, we have so many physios working out of barbell gyms and CrossFit spaces and that kind of stuff. It's just like socially now it's just normalized. These things go together, but that very much was like oil and water for such a long time. So I think that's an interesting kind of, that was just across the board. That wasn't even female related.
No, I totally agree. If we talk about pregnancy and postpartum, and Christina has a really great systematic review and meta-analysis coming up. And one of the things that we're talking about really is load. We are underdosing our pregnant and postpartum athletes, people just in general.
Right.
Resistance bands, 5-pound dumbbells, like, give me a break. We can do a lot better than that. If you're brand new to it, that's one thing. But if we're telling people who are used to lifting 150 pounds for a bench press, go down to 10-pound dumbbells, don't go over 20 pounds. Like,
right.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that goes back to kind of one of the points that we were talking about earlier is this is such a broad conversation because in the States, we're incredibly inactive. Hopefully you're more active up north. I'm guessing you might be. I don't know.
I'm not sure.
Not much. Okay. All right. Well, we suck. So, I mean, you have this population that's incredibly inactive. How do you encourage them to start exercising? But also, when you have a reasonably active population, how do you encourage them to stay active and not go to nothing in pregnancy? And then when you have a very active population, how do you not scare the crap out of them and be like, hey, you're all right? Because all those conversations, like, I think, and it's also, again, I think dependent on the algorithm, which goes back to the peer review conversation. And where do we get our information from and where do we digest it? Because the average inactive person isn't going to relate at all to a load conversation. And at the same time, somebody who's, lifting regularly in pregnancy isn't going to relate well to be like, oh, you just need to rest, like.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think part of it, we have to start relatively small. If you think about Christina's cross-sectional study, like that was looking at people who had lifted more than 80% of their 1 RM before pregnancy and continued during their pregnancy. And we actually found that those who did what they are not supposed to do according to the guidelines, and they continued right throughout their pregnancy, they had much lower risk of pregnancy complications than those who stopped and followed current guidelines. And I can't knock the guidelines too much. They follow a very important process, but they are also designed to be living and things that adapt and change as the information also adapts and change. I think, we've come a long way in the last 5-6 years in terms of shifting our mentality about physical activity and exercise in pregnancy. I also think we're about to have a major shift with some upcoming work with a group that I'm working with later this year. We have a really interesting project I think will shift our understanding yet again to be much more proactive than we have been.
You're like a mystery book. I was like, you're like a series of mystery books.
I love to tell, but I can't.
I know. And that's like, You are. You're just like, what's the next page? What's the next in the series? I want to know. You leave us cliffhanging here. Okay. And that's why I have to be careful asking my questions, because I'm like, I know you can't answer certain things. Okay. So maybe this one, let me try it this way. For you, what are the next big frontiers that haven't been tackled yet, but are going to be in reach?
I think for me, we have to understand what the upper limit of physical activity and exercise is during pregnancy. That is a huge gap. It's a huge unknown. And it is a huge source of fear for many athletes.
Yeah.
Right. So, we have people who are, stopping, I was recently asked about, how long can you continue in contact sport during pregnancy? Well, we don't know because we don't have any data. And so there is a rule in certain sports where you stop right at 12 weeks. Well, what about if you go to 13 and 1, 13 days, 13 weeks and 1 day? Is the level of risk going to be so much higher that you shouldn't do it compared to 12 weeks and 6 days, right? 2 days difference.
Right.
But people are making changes and decisions about they are not going to compete at the Olympics. They're not going to compete in the very final game of their entire career.
Yeah.
Because there is this very clear threshold, which unfortunately isn't based on research, but we have data coming out, thankfully, very soon, which I think is going to start to change that. But understanding the limits of what you can and cannot do in pregnancy is really important. And then the postpartum period, like my PhD was entirely on postpartum physical activity and exercise. I defended in 2010. And there's still such a limited amount of information about what you can and cannot do. How do you return? How early can you return? The postpartum guidelines are going to address some of this, but we just don't have enough. It's getting better. We're getting some more information. But postpartum is a huge, huge gap that we really have to address. If we can help return people to activity in the postpartum period in a way that they're going to reduce the risk of injury, reduce the risk of having, chronic diseases or pelvic floor dysfunction and all that sort of thing. We set them up for being active throughout the rest of their lives. It's a really, really important time point that we haven't really paid enough attention to.
Yeah. As a researcher, like, if you're looking at trying to establish something like that, are you looking at recruiting somebody before pregnancy, kind of like you did in the recent study, being like, hey, you're considering this with the idea that, can we follow you all the way through? And you're almost like my research subject for life. Is that like your dream subject? Or
that would be beautiful. I would love that. So with one of Christina's studies, we have a retrospective study where we're asking people to provide their training logs from when they were pregnant to see about how their heavy lifting was. Her second study, we decided we were going to do a prospective study. So trying to recruit people from either before pregnancy or an early pregnancy and actually follow them out. I believe it's to 18 months postpartum. The biggest problem we have in the area is that there is extremely limited funding to support women's health in general, but pregnancy postpartum especially. It's a struggle to find the dollars, the interest, because these studies are, at the end of the day, quite expensive to run and to be able to support. The Canadian guidelines that are coming up, there was zero funding for it. Nothing. It was, basically coming out because I saw a major gap. I convinced a colleague of mine to help me run it. And, the data that's coming out of it is basically from volunteers who are undergrads who are going to be on some really major papers that I think are going to change the field. But not everybody is crazy enough to do something like that. Like I'm aging because of it. I'm tired. And if there was just a bit of funding to be able to support this type of work, it would make a world of difference. Just imagine what we could do.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I know Jill Biden, at least here in the States, they were going to put a couple $100 million towards something and to some people that might seem like a lot of money. To me, it seems like peanuts. It's just like there's so many like research focuses that could use even a fraction of that, like how do you even decide where that goes? And I mean, compared to a bunch of other things, I feel like it's not enough, not even remotely, but I mean, I'll take it. We'll take it.
For sure.
But I
in
mean,
Canada, sorry, go ahead.
no. Yeah. What do you guys do up there?
Yeah, in Canada, 7% of all grant funding actually goes towards women's health, and
Mhm.
a fraction of that is going to go to pregnancy, and
Right.
hardly anything goes to physical activity and exercise. But it
Right.
is one of the least expensive, most accessible activities that we can do to improve overall mental health and well-being, as well as prevention of chronic disease at a really, really important time where people need support from
Right.
certainly their partners, also their family, especially from society. We shouldn't just be telling somebody who is newly
Right.
postpartum, oh, you can do it all. You're on vacation in the postpartum period, which is what people used to say to me. And I'm like, this is not a vacation.
No, absolutely not.
Wonderful, but it's not.
Yeah. No, not even close. No, to your point, like research here shouldn't be existing out of the goodness of somebody's heart. Like
Mhm.
y'all should be getting paid for this stuff. But no, but I mean, I think back to even like the founding of our physio organization here in the States, focusing on, I think it was like the such section on obstetrics and gynecology started because there were physios who had their own problems and said, okay, we need to fix this. Let's come up
Yeah.
with this. And it's always been us driving it.
Mhm.
And I feel like the other stuff comes later.
Mhm.
But I am excited. And I think you've played a huge role in this, inspiring more people to go, females to go into research. So to go back, and I know you were in Christine Yu's book, right? I feel like everybody I know was in her book, and I was like, I'm reading. I'm like, I know her, and I know her. It was such a great book, and Christine came on the podcast. I was like, you just interviewed all my Instagram friends, which was awesome. But it keeps coming back to we need more women at the table.
We do.
So for you, if you were talking to a physio student or a young physio who is like, no, I think I'm not sure, like what would you say to them to be like, hey, this is why I got into this. This is what you can do too. What would you say to them?
So, I'm always happy to talk, and I think it's important to, show both the good and the bad, because there's, lots of good, bad. It's a struggle some days, and it's just like thrilling and exciting other days. During my PhD, I had a lot of people who were like, "Why are you doing women's health?" And the studies that you're doing are very basic, and that's totally fine. I think the more important thing is that we absolutely have to have the role models. You can talk to one or two people, but if you have the role models that are actually, doing the
Yep.
research, they're supporting other female researchers or physios or physicians,
Yep.
but also showing that, that there's often a perception, especially in research, that to get to a really high level, that you have to give up most parts of your life, right? And
Mm,
so you have to focus and work 60, 80 hours a week. I think that's totally ridiculous. Certainly you're going to have to, balance. But I think it's also, my kids are a huge part of my life. They changed my research. I was having this conversation with my 11-year-old yesterday. She was talking about how kids on the playground were saying that, oh, it was really too bad in her kickball, team, that there were no boys on the team. And so she's just like, this is terrible, because they are basically saying that I'm not good enough. I'm like, you know what? You just have to get out there and you show them that, you have a right to be there and that you're good at it, and you just keep going. And
yeah.
I think it's the same thing when we talk about if you're in physio or research or whatever else, like having those role models, somebody who can show you that it can be done. If you can see it, you believe it.
Mhm.
Being the first is always going to be the hardest. I was really lucky. Michelle Matola was my PhD supervisor. She went through at a time where there were no female physiologists. Nobody was doing exercise in pregnancy. She really paved the way for me to be able to do what I do today. And so I could see it. I could do it. She had kids. I was like, oh, I can too.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. And I love seeing, young researchers come up through. Jenny Lacrosse, I've known her since she was a PT student and a resident. And then obviously a huge fan of Christina. Don't know how she does it all between, teaching in clinic and kids and all that kind of stuff. But no, I think that's such a great point, is we need to show that it's attainable. It's not this like unreachable sort of thing. So for you, what does an average week look like for a mom researcher?
I don't ever have a week that's the same. This last, I work in semesters because I also teach at the university. This semester has been a little bit crazy because I think I've been away as much as I have been home. But for the most part, I do try to silo off the time that I'm with my husband and my kids in the evening. And, sometimes I'll start really early in the morning. Sometimes I'll work late at night. But it's a balance that makes me generally happy. And when I'm unhappy with the balance, then I, figure out a way to start to change it.
Yeah. Is your favorite when you're like more in dialed in research creation mode, or when you're in presentation mode? Which do you prefer?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think I can be quite happy with either.
Okay.
Yeah, I love the creation. I love coming up with ideas. As messaging back and forth with Christina this morning, we have a wicked new idea we're gonna do it. It's gonna be really cool and fun. But I also really love to go and speak to audiences that really aren't that familiar with exercise and pregnancy and postpartum. Because you can actually change a lot of minds. You get really cool and interesting questions that then I take back to my own research and start to change things as well.
Yeah, I think that would be my biggest problem. Would be I would have too many ideas and not enough way to implement them, which is why I'm just going to throw stuff at you guys so you can figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, trying to keep it manageable, I think, is probably the
Right.
hardest part of my job. There's so
Yeah.
much that needs to be done, but that's also
Yeah.
why we need to build capacity. And
Yeah.
we have these brilliant upcoming researchers who are starting to make major impacts, and supporting them as they move through their career is really important. There's so much to do. We don't need to compete. We just need to go and support and work together.
No, and that's I think at least in pelvic health, pregnancy, postpartum, I feel like that's always been a bit of the culture, not only the clinicians, but I'm seeing so much more in the researcher is that there's so much collaboration. It's not a pissing match. It's very much let you know something about this, something about this. Let's make something move forward. And again, I think that's why we keep making changes quickly as we are, because it's just so collaborative. And I'm glad we don't need any more chaos in the world right now. We need to keep moving forward.
For sure.
For sure. All right. I'm going to edit the questions at the end, because usually I ask about mom life a bit more, but we hit that in the last time you were on the show. But rando things here: book you're reading or a podcast you're listening to now. You don't have time.
I don't have time. Every once in a while, I'll pick up my daughter's books.
What's your daughter reading?
Fantasy, actually, and
Okay.
she seems to have picked it up too. So
okay. Do you guys read together? Like, will you just like read quietly together, or does she read to you? Do you read to her?
No, she'll like, there's a couch right back there. So if I'm doing work, she'll read behind me.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I actually, that is one of the things that I have somewhat given up. And I was a very avid reader. So I'll read on vacation, but not typically during my life.
Okay. No, my problem is I will read fiction at bedtime, but I fall asleep in probably less than 5 minutes. So it makes the book go very slowly. I have to shut the Kindle Wi-Fi off so it keeps the book from the library and doesn't disappear, because it takes me too long. So yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. And then, all right, here, who's somebody who's got your attention right now in your space? Like, who's somebody that we don't know about yet, but we're gonna.
Oh, that you don't know about
that
yet.
I don't know. Yes.
Oh, you're putting me on the spot, because I'm like, well, Brittany Matinchuk. So she's actually my PhD student right now. She does work in sleep, and her ideas and her thoughts about the importance of sleep. I think if you had a conversation with her,
Yeah.
She would probably, and we've had these discussions. I think she's pretty strong
Ooh.
advocate that sleep is certainly as important as physical activity and exercise, but probably more so when we talk about
Okay.
pregnancy and postpartum. So she's doing some really, really cool work. Some of it I just don't understand, but I'm very upfront about that, mostly statistics. But yeah, watch out for her. She is
Okay.
going to make a major change, focusing on sleep. It's something we know is important in pregnancy and postpartum. I don't think we understand how important it is yet.
Yeah. No, I would totally agree. I spent the
Hmm.
maybe about 2 years ago just dialing in and being like, I'm just going to prioritize sleep.
Hmm.
And it has made a magnificent difference. My kids put me to sleep, which is it's nice. They're at the age they can do that now. And it's a big joke in our house that, you haven't put mom to bed yet.
Yeah.
But I think also too, now that my sleep is dialed in, if I look at some of my wearables, if things are off, I know
Hmm.
it's not that. I know it's something else. And I think
Mm.
that's been a really interesting thing because before you have so many different things. You're like, oh, it's just my sleep. It's just my sleep. Now it's like, no, 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 it's not that. What
Yeah.
else is it?
Yeah.
But that's a conversation I have with moms all the time, especially the new moms that their kids aren't sleeping or have digestive issues or things like that. I'm like, we need to help your baby get sleep first
Oh
because you're
yeah.
not going to sleep until they sleep.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it really, I almost feel like we've got to have these parallel conversations of, yes, sleep is really important to us and this is why, but this
Hmm.
is how we can help our moms get our kids to sleep
Yeah.
because you can talk about sleep till the cows come home. But like, I mean, my oldest did not sleep till he was 5. Like it's for real.
Oh, it changes your
Yeah.
entire life. And actually, that's one of the really interesting findings that we're finding with postpartum is
Mhm.
the impact of physical activity and sleep on mental health. Like there's
Mm.
a this guideline will be really pushing mental
Okay.
health, and sleep is a
Yep.
huge component. We need to figure it out.
Yeah. No,
I need to figure it out.
okay. Well, we'll chat. No, we'll have your kids put you to bed too before you know it. But I will say some of my ability to sleep now is because like on weekends, like my 13-year-old, he's sleeping 12 hours a night because he's
Ooh,
at that stage. And I'm like, you're making up for the first 5 years of your life where you
yes.
did not. I'm like, thank
I
you,
look
God, for
forward to
that.
that one.
All right. So the next time we come on, we'll have figured out your sleep problems. We will have started you
Hmm,
on a fiction kick. All that good stuff.
deal.
Sounds good. All right. Well, hopefully it won't be a year and a half before the next time we chat again. But thank you so much for all the
Mhm.
stuff that you're doing and publishing and speaking with people. If you guys want to know more about Margie's work, and then she's always posting too, looking for research participants, which is incredibly important. You can find her on Instagram at Exercise and Pregnancy. Margie Davenport, thank you for all you do, and thanks for joining me
Mhm.
on the Active Mom Postpartum Podcast.
Lovely to talk as always.
Thanks.
Did you enjoy the podcast? If so, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes and tell a friend to do the same. Are you a postpartum mom or postpartum pro wanting to know more about getting back to running after baby? Check out all my free goodies on carriepagliano.com. This podcast represents the opinions of Dr. Carrie Pagliano and her guests to the show. The content should not be taken as medical advice and is for entertainment purposes only. Always consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions.